Hi guys! Today I'm going to be reviewing all the books that I read in November. Just diving right into it. It was a pretty good month, actually very consistent. I had, I believe, 8 4-star books, 4-star reads-ish, and 1 3-star book. So no superstar new favorite books, but also no duds. So no complaints there. Starting with a book that I mostly read actually in October but did not finish in time for my wrap-up was For the Wolf by Hannah Whitten. And this book, I think like a lot of people, I assumed was going to be more of a Red Riding Hood story or retelling, but definitely turned out to be more of a Beauty and the Beast retelling. But that's okay because I like that too. And the story follows a young woman named Red, and she is the second-born princess of a kingdom who sacrifices their second daughters to the woods. It is said that the first daughter is for the throne and the second daughter is for the wolf, but no one really quite knows what that means other than that the second daughters never come back. Red is obviously very anxious about this fate. She's sort of resigned herself to it though. Her older sister is devastated and is looking for ways to try to prevent Red from having to go, but Red is just sort of ready to make her sacrifice. And when she gets to the woods, things are not quite what she seems, and she meets the man that goes by the title of the wolf. You have sort of a Beauty and the Beast dynamic, and I really liked this book. It was really atmospheric. The woods were very dark and creepy, but they weren't necessarily evil I think a lot of, or that's what I was expecting going into this. They just sort of were what they were, and they were desperately, the woods was desperately trying to survive. I think the connection both her and the wolf character had to the woods was really interesting, and I've never quite seen it done that way before, so I really enjoyed this. This also had a really, really good slow burn romance, which is my favorite. They were never quite enemies, but the sort of struggle again between duty and desire was really strong, and I loved this book, and I think about it a lot. I read it, almost a month ago, or more than a month ago now, and I'm still thinking about it, and I think it's a sign of a really good book. This is a really great fall going into winter read, as the title or the cover sort of hints at. Again, the woods themselves are very atmospheric, so if you like sort of a dark, creepy fantasy in the fall or winter, this is a great one to pick up. And I did not know going into this that it was going to be I thought it was a standalone. I don't know why. I don't know why I'm assuming all these fantasy reads that I've been picking up are going to be standalones, because that's very rarely the case. But there is a second one, I believe, called For the Throne coming out soon, I believe next year, and I'm very excited about that one. I'm really curious to see where the characters in this book story go and how they sort of wrap up this mystery and this sort of thing that is plaguing their land. So very much enjoyed this one and gave it 4 stars. Next book I picked up was a romance, and it is the third in a series of romances that I've really found myself just falling in love with, and that is Well Matched by Jen DeLuca. This is part of the Well Met romance series that really focuses or surrounds this small town's Renaissance festival every year. The first book follows a young woman named Emily, and she's moving into this small town to help her older sister after her older sister's gotten into a bad accident, and she sort of ends up falling in love with this small town and its Renaissance festival and becoming really invested in this tradition every year that this town kind of holds dearly. This book is the third book, and it follows Emily's older sister, April. And April's lived in this town for a really long time, but she's never really found herself investing her life in it. She works in the city, sort of a couple miles away, but she chose to settle down here for her young daughter. April is a single mom, and around the time that this book takes place, she's sort of ready to move on. Her daughter is about to graduate high school and go on to college, and April never really wanted to live here forever. She's always fancied herself more of a city girl, so she's kind of getting ready to move on, sell her house, and her loved ones that are in love with the town are obviously devastated about this, because this town has brought her and her sister closer, and her daughter has a really strong connection to this town. But April is really committed to sort of making the best decision for her. She enlists in the help of her friend Mitch, who has been in all 3 books so far. He plays this sort of Scotsman role in the festival, and he's really handy. So he agrees to help her fix up her house to sell in exchange for her accompanying him to a family sort of reunion event and posing as his girlfriend, because his family doesn't think he's ever going to settle down, and he just doesn't want to deal with the questions this year. So she agrees, and obviously fake dating, one thing leads to another, and real feelings start to develop. And April finds herself sort of conflicted between like her desire to leave this town and her desire to explore what could be with Mitch. And this was really cute. I liked this one a lot. I think the first book is really hard to beat in my heart because it was so good. It was my favorite, I think, of the three. But this one was a really close second. I loved April and Mitch. Mitch especially is such like a little golden retriever soft boy. I love him. If you like fake dating, would definitely recommend this book. It does sort of deal with the issue that I find in fake dating a lot, in which real feelings between the two develop and like they don't recognize that the other has real feelings for them. So it's just, I don't know, that part's a little frustrating because it makes the characters come off as a little dumb or naive, I guess. But, you know, I guess you gotta do it for the sake of the third act conflict. But oh well. So I also gave this 4 stars, and I cannot wait to see what Jen DeLuca does next, because this series has been so fun. Next up, I picked up Naomi Novik's Uprooted, and did not realize when I picked this up quite how similar it was going to be to For the Wolf. Not exactly, but it had a lot of very similar themes. So that was kind of interesting reading them back to back. I did read Naomi Novik's other sort of standalone fantasy, Spinning Silver, earlier this year and fell in love with it. So I wasn't really quite sure how I was going to feel about this one, because I've seen a lot of reviews saying that like Spinning Silver is amazing, but like this one is really divisive. So I wasn't sure if I was going to love it or hate it, but I did actually think I believe this was on my 5-star prediction list that I came out with a couple months ago. Unfortunately, it did fall a little bit short. Not quite as strong as Spinning Silver, in my opinion, and that is mostly because so much happens in this book. It felt like there was a climax every couple of hundred of pages, and just pacing-wise, really threw me off and left me, like, honestly drained by the end of it. I was just like, this felt like it should have been a series, not a standalone, because so much was crammed into these, like, 500 pages. It was a little overwhelming. This book follows a young woman named Agnieszka, I think is actually how it's pronounced. And it is very sort of like Eastern European inspired, sort of like Naomi Novik's other book. And she lives in this small town, a small village really, that borders creepy woods. Every 10 years or so, this wizard named the Dragon comes to, not her village specifically, but like all the villages in the valley that he's sort of the lord of kind of get together, and he chooses one 17-year-old girl to sort of become his apprentice and live with him for the next 10 years. And obviously, like, the townspeople are kind of like, why do you take this girl for like 10 years? Like, what do you do to her? No one really knows. But the young women do come back after the 10 years. They just find that they've changed so much that small village life is no longer for them, and they tend to move on. And so Agnieszka grows up pretty much convinced that her best friend is going to be chosen by the dragon, Kasia, and because Kassia's like just good at everything. She's good at cooking, she's good at like sewing and weaving, she's good at dancing, and the dragon tends to pick like the most interesting girl. So basically for their whole lives, Agnieszka is like grieving the loss of her friend before it even happens. And the day of the choosing, the dragon chooses Agnieszka, which no one expects. So she finds herself going to his tower, not really quite sure what to expect, because again, no one really quite knows what the dragon does with these girls, and she finds out that she has magic. This is a very interesting one. The dynamic between our main character and the dragon is sort of frustrating at first. It is, again, like a more like a slow burn romance, but there's also this weird dynamic where like he thinks she's an idiot at first and like like, he reminded me a lot of Gordon Ramsay in the beginning, where he just, like, berates her, and obviously that's not super charming, but it's founded in a place of misunderstanding. Her magic is really different from his magic. Hers is more intuitive, and she kind of just goes with what she feels. He's much more of, like, a diligent, like, precise magic worker, and so they don't really quite understand each other at first, and it's really rocky, but they sort of, I do like how their relationship grows and how their magic begins to work together. There's some really cool scenes that Novick writes where, like, they literally blend their magic and sort of feed their power to one another, and the way that manifests is just really interesting and cool, and I've never quite seen anything like that before. It becomes something, like, really intimate between the two of them, which is, again, a really interesting way, I think, to develop their relationship. So I did enjoy that, and, like, the first couple hundred pages of the book really follow this sort of, like, apprenticeship that Agnieszka has with the dragon, and sort of learning his role in the kingdom, and sort of breaking down the mystery that is him. You find out that he's working really hard to basically prevent this creepy magical woods from spreading and taking over the entire valley and then the entire world, basically, because there's some really creepy creatures that literally, like, kidnap villagers, and basically their life force feeds the forest. It's really dark and creepy. So the dragon sort of devoted his life to trying to contain the woods and hopefully beat it back some, and Agnieszka becomes really dedicated to helping him do this. And like I said, there's so much in this book. There's, like, about halfway through this really creepy scene in which they go into the woods. Like, it feels like the climax of the book. Like, it's so just thrilling. It's a page turner. You can't put it down. And then, like, once that resolves, I'm like, what else is there to do after this? I don't know. The next chunk of the book felt really slow as a result of that, because it felt like things had sort of wrapped up in a way, and then there was still more. Again, it felt like it should have been separated into 2 books. So while I liked the story, the pacing was just really all over the place for me. And again, by the end of it, I just felt so exhausted. So not quite the 5-star read that Spinning Silver was. I think the way that Naomi Novik wove her sort of 3 independent stories in that one together was a lot more sophisticated than the way she kind of handled the different parts of this story and all the elements that she wanted to tackle. Overall, I did enjoy it, and I thought it was a really nice atmospheric read. Again, good creepy forest vibes for the fall, but not my favorite by her yet. Next up was quite the chonker, and that was Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff. This was my first J. Kristoff read, so I really wasn't quite sure what to expect, but I was really intrigued by the premise. This book follows Gabriel de Leon. He is the last Silver Saint, which is an order of vampire and monster hunters, and he is basically explaining his life story. The framing of this book is very much like Interview with a Vampire, in which he's sitting down with a vampire who's holding him captive, and that vampire is asking him questions about his life and recording it for history, basically. Gabriel sort of flops back and forth between his very young adolescence, in which he joins the Order of the Silver Saints, and then much later on, about 15, 20 years later, sort of after he's become this legend and sort of fallen to this broken man and this D&D-esque adventure that ensues around that point of his life. The story of this was 5 stars. The structure brought it down to 4 stars for me. I don't want to criticize it too much, because I think the way that I understand why Kristoff structured it the way he did, but I also think it took a lot of tension out of scenes that happen in his youth, because certain characters, or like Gabriel himself, make it through this, Scenes that would have otherwise been very intense lacked that a little bit, because Gabriel sort of hints at his friend's fate a lot in the sort of structure part, or like overall structure part of the book, where he's sitting explaining things to the vampire. And yeah, I don't know. And then the constant back and forth between young Gabriel and like 30-ish-year-old Gabriel was a little jarring. I really found myself invested in the story of his youth and again how he joined the Silver Saints and his sort of first year or two there, establishing himself as sort of a formidable member. And I really think that alone could have been the first installment of this series. And then you would suddenly jump to like 15 years later where he's this bitter, broken man, just sort of like at rock bottom. It was sort of not disappointing because I wanted to see like what got him to that point, but the tone just, it shifted a lot. But I did get used to it after a while and found myself really invested in Gabriel. He definitely grows on you, even the parts where he's sort of feeling sorry for himself. He's a really interesting character. I was very invested in his story and his background, how he became this legend. There's so much, and I'm like only scratching the surface because I don't really want to give too much away, but I really enjoyed this, and I think if you're feeling vampires at all, you should pick this one up. I thought the lore was really cool. It was familiar, but also like it had enough unique about it that you wanted to know more. But yeah, so I gave this one 4 stars. I have a whole reading vlog I'll link down below if you want to know sort of more of my thoughts. I don't go into spoilers too much or anything, but I feel like I do a better job of explaining the overall story of this because I'm trying not to go on forever about just one book in this wrap up. But this was really good, highly recommend, and I can't wait for the next one to come out. I think this story has a lot of potential, and now where I'm more used to sort of the narrative structure, I think the second one will be even better. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Also, this book made me want illustrations in fantasy books to be like the norm because they just added so much to the story. I loved just like the style of the illustrations. Like sometimes I think it can be difficult to picture a character, and this book just like took care of that problem for you because they're like, this is what that character looks like. So that was fun and I really enjoyed that, and I believe the artist is Monolime on Instagram, so definitely recommend following them because it's so good. Next up was my second 800-page book in a row, which was totally unintentional, and I didn't realize how long this book actually was, but it was a buddy read, so that was exciting. And also the second series that I've started by this author, and that is Sarah J. Maas's Crescent City House of Earth and Blood. If you've been following me for a little bit, you probably know I recently read the entirety of the ACOTAR series and had a lot of fun with it. It was by no means perfect. It had a lot of just writing issues that were not my favorite, but like Sarah J. Maas really makes you enjoy her books like despite yourself. Her character and plot work is really fun and it makes it hard to put her stories down. So I was really excited to get into this one. This one's more of an urban fantasy, and other than that, I really had no idea what to expect. And this book follows a young woman named Bryce. She is half fae and half human, and she's living in this place called Crescent City, which is home to several other sort of like supernatural fairy tale-esque kind of peoples. She is sort of looked down upon for being half human because this world really does not respect humans at all. But like she's living her best life. She's a party girl, and her best friend Danica is the alpha of this shifter pack of wolves. The shifters are sort of like the police unit of Crescent City. They take care of crime and stuff like that. And this book starts off with a criminal that Danica has busted for basically like planning a terrorist attack getting released from jail on a technicality. So Bryce and Danica are really anxious about that because they're like, oh God, what if this guy retaliates against Danica? And part one, and this is not a spoiler because it is on the flap, basically in the plot description, part one ends with Danica's brutal murder, both with her and her entire pack. So Bryce basically loses all of her best friends in one horrible night. Then we jump 2 years later, and a string of murders very similar to Danica's is starting to take place around Crescent City, and Bryce is enlisted in sort of helping the investigation because she was so close to Danica and has found herself sort of in the middle of the drama in the present timeline. And she's partnered up with this fallen angel character named Hunt, who has very strong Rhysand vibes if you've read A Court of Thorns and Roses. and they team up to try to figure out who the heck killed Danica and who is killing these people now. I have 2 separate videos about this, one that vlogs my reading and another one where Steffi and I, who buddy read this with me, sit down and chat about our thoughts. So if you're more curious about my more specific thoughts about this, I would definitely recommend watching those videos. But overall, I did enjoy this. I don't think it had a very strong beginning. The world building was very confusing at first. I'm like pretty familiar with fantasy for the most part. Like that's my main genre, so I didn't think I would struggle all that much, but the world that Sarah J. Maas built in this is so much bigger than I thought it was going to be, and I don't think she does a great job really explaining the structure of certain things very well at first. I feel like eventually I did catch on, but it was because I kind of had to just like have faith that I would and push through the parts that I didn't understand earlier in the book. So that unfortunately was a bit of a bummer for me because I was really excited about this, and I've heard that this was like her best written book to date, so I was a little confused at first. But as I said about the ACOTAR series, the characters and the plot in this were so fun. I was really invested in Bryce and Hunt. They were great characters. The last 300 pages of this book were just like, the payoff was amazing, and I did not want to put this book down. So again, she has these really great character moments that just like make you root for these characters, and it's really fun when you're reading a book and like you genuinely care about what's gonna happen to these characters. So I think she did a good job with that. Overall, not my favorite Sarah J. Maas book, and I gave it about like a 3.5 to 4 star. It's somewhere in there. Goodreads obviously doesn't do half-star ratings, so it's just sort of in my mind. But I do think this series has a lot of potential though, and I'm really excited to pick up the second one next year. After that, I needed kind of like a fantasy decompress / like a light read, and I picked up Window Shopping by Tessa Bailey. Tessa Bailey has been a very like hit or miss author for me. She writes her male characters very similarly book to book, and like that's not my favorite, especially because her type seems to be like very alpha, possessive, jealous, like caveman, and that's not my type. So it's hard to like read a romance book and be invested in the hero character when they're just like so off-putting. But I was really intrigued by the premise of this. I thought it sounded like a really cute holiday romance, and it was. This is actually probably my favorite Tessa Bailey book to date. So basically the premise of this book is that this young woman who is sort of down on her luck is in Manhattan walking home, and she kind of comes across this window display, and it's the holiday season, so it's decorated for the holidays, and she's staring at it and like is not super impressed, but this guy comes up to her and is like, "What do you think of the window?" And she like is brutally honest, and she's like, "I think it's a disaster. Like, this is not gonna make people want to come in at all." I think it's like penguins assembling toys, and she's like, "People don't want to think about like how their toys are made. It totally takes the magic out of it." And the guy's like, "You know, you're right." And he happens to be the general manager of that store, which she did not know, and she's kind of horrified at first, but he strongly encourages her to apply for the window decorator job. She doesn't think she's gonna get it because she is fresh out of jail and pretty much thinks that's gonna eliminate her from the job, but this guy was so impressed with her that, you know, he makes it happen. So you have this really fun, like, inverted Grumpy Sunshine dynamic where she's the grump and he's so cute and sunshiny and happy. I really liked that because, again, it's sort of a different take on the hero character for Tessa Bailey, and I appreciated that he had this really light, goofy side. He wore, like, cute little Christmas bow ties and just had a really sunny disposition, and I thought that was a lot of fun. Obviously, for the more, like, intimate romance scenes, he had a bit more of a dominant side because, again, that's just Tessa Bailey's thing, but I think it worked well where, like, it wasn't expected of him, and so the main character was like, "Whoa, who are you?" But yeah, I thought it was a really fun, light, Christmas time romance if you're looking for one of those, and I think it was, again, one of the more palatable male heroes that Tessa Bailey has had. So I gave this one 4 stars. This is my favorite one by her so far. I think this will be a fun sort of romance to return to whenever I'm feeling like I want a holiday comfort read. It had sort of the feeling of a like Hallmark holiday movie, but with a spicy side. So if that sounds appealing to you, I would recommend it. Next up, I read another shorty, and that was Zen Cho's The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water. I've been really enjoying novellas lately, and this one was quite intriguing to me, and it follows a monk that is part of this Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water. She sort of ends up with this group of not quite bandits, but they're not quite law-abiding either, and she joins their group and cooks for them and stuff like that as they travel around, just trying to make a living in a very sort of turbulent political atmosphere. I don't know, it's like a short little adventure. There's some martial arts, there's some mysticism. It was not my favorite novella, I will say that, just because I felt like it had the potential to be like a lot more, and because it felt so abbreviated, I wasn't really invested. There was one really good twist that I enjoyed, but other than that, it was not the most like memorable novella in my opinion. But I am curious to read Zen Cho's other work. She's got a book that just came out, I believe, called Blackwater Sister, and I'm really interested in that. So I'm curious to see sort of like what her narrative style is beyond just this book, because this had a very like historical fiction fantasy feel to it. It was fun, but I gave it 3 stars because I just don't think it lived up to the potential that it could have had. And finally this month I read one of my most anticipated books of the year. It was also a recent Fairy Loot choice, and that was Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. This is a spinoff of the very popular Caraval series, which I have not read, but definitely has some like character cameos from that series, and also follows a character who first appeared in that series named Jax, and he is the Prince of Hearts, which is like immortal. They're called fates, so there's a couple different ones that pop up in this book. He's one of them. There's also a fate named Poison and a fate named the Unwed Bride, I believe. There's sort of like these immortal beings that encompass this like tragic feeling, and I don't know, it was really interesting. It definitely made me want to pick up the Caraval series to kind of learn more about it, because there was sort of this event that happens in the beginning that hints at what I'm assuming is the main plot of Caraval and its sequels, and sort of mentions it in passing, like you're supposed to be familiar with it. So while I think you can definitely read this on its own, I believe it'll probably be a bit stronger if you have background knowledge of the world. But this book follows a young woman named Evangeline Fox who has pink hair and works in a curiosity shop, and she has sort of like a romantic relationship with this man named Luke. And one day she finds out that Luke is engaged to her stepsister, who she didn't even know like knew him. So this is obviously very distressing to her. She is in love with Luke, and so she goes to the temple of the Prince of Hearts to appeal to him and have him stop the wedding. The Prince of Hearts, Jax, agrees to do this in exchange for 3 kisses. Not with him, because his kiss is fatal unless you are his one true love, but with 3 people of his choosing and like the timing of his choosing. She doesn't like the sound of this, but she's so desperate that she agrees, and Jax stops the wedding for her, but not in the way that she wanted. And that's basically like the synopsis on the flap, and all of that happened in the first 50 pages. So like once I got to that point, I was like, I thought that was gonna be like the whole novel, but okay. So this book definitely kind of goes in a different direction than I was expecting, because again, like what I knew about this going in was over and done with so fast. I was like, well, what the heck happens now? And I don't know, it was so fun. I got through this book so fast because it was like just such a page turner. The pacing was incredibly speedy. The chapters were really short, if that's your thing. I know people really like pacing wise short chapters. It was broken up with a lot of like articles, like gossip column articles, which was fun because you get this sort of outside perspective of the events that like Evangeline is living through. And yeah, I don't know, this was a really fun adventure story, and I cannot wait for the second book to come out because I really want to see where it goes. In the meantime, I'm definitely going to go read the Caraval series because I want to know more about this world. I had so much fun. It went in directions I was not expecting. There were sort of like paranormal elements that I was not expecting, and if you know, you know. But yeah, I don't know. I think this series has so much potential, and I only gave it 4 stars because I felt like I had in sort of incomplete view of the world because I hadn't read Caraval, and while this was promoted so heavily as like a standalone spinoff, I was a little disappointed that like I felt like I was missing something because I hadn't read Caraval, but that's fine. I'm just gonna go back and read them. So yeah, this was a really strong like fairy tale-ish book to read for the end of the month, especially like going into December. I felt like this had really like Nutcracker feels almost, not entirely, but like similar vibes. Very fairy tale, enchanting vibes, and I just had so much fun with this. So very strong 4 stars. And yeah, that wraps up my reading month for November. Again, very consistent, mostly 4s across the board with the exception of the novella, which was only a 3-star, but I'm not mad, you know? It was very consistent, very, very strong reads, and a couple of them I think like have the potential to get even better as their series move on, so very excited to see where those go, and very excited to see what December holds. And yeah, so let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books. What were your thoughts? I think I read some very like popular books this month too, so I'm hoping to be able to discuss it with some people. And yeah, feel free to subscribe to my channel, like this video, follow my socials down in the description box below, and have a lovely day and a lovely December reading month. I'm so excited to get into holiday, like, cozy reads, and I think this last month was a really good transition into this month. So yeah, have a lovely day. Bye!